Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
Passchendaele with tree bursts. Ernest Hemingway.
To sum it up, we were fighting the cold, the wet underfoot, the snow, the tops of the trees, the 88s with their shrapnel. And let us not forget the Germans. These were the worst conditions I ever had a fight under. Private Robert Bradachich.
As the snow melted during the day, many bodies of GIs and Germans were exposed. They were among the wrecked tanks, half-track jeeps, and abandoned artillery. In a nearby gulch, one GI was evidently blown off his bulldozer when the blade hit a landmine. As it warmed up during the day, his body had that terrible, sweet, sickening smell of rotting flesh. There was a sight that brought tears to our eyes. The partially melted snow on the bodies of over 100 GIs. It appeared to us that they had been attacking up an incline toward German tank positions, which had supporting automatic weapons positions on each side. Evidently, a major had been leading the assault because his body was close to the front of the others. Why he had ordered a direct assault on such a dug-in position will probably never be known. Some of the bodies were sprawling and faced away from the German positions, possibly indicating they were trying to save themselves when machine guns cut them down. There were no dead German bodies in evidence. All the dead GIs were dressed in OD uniforms with newly issued, unfaded green field jackets. Many steel helmets had been knocked off. Dressed as they were is an indication to us that they were inexperienced green troops. Private Ed Laughlin, 82nd Airborne Division. And he's viewing there the aftermath of probably the Call Trail, some of the worst fighting that happened in Hürtgen.
Thanks, John. That was good, but could you make it more American like me and Jim, the way you read it?
I just can't. I mean, I can't be as American as you guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA, your Second World War podcast, with me, Al Murray, James Holland, and John McManus. And we are on our second episode, as you probably gather from the quotes there at the top, about the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, the battle for the Hurtgen Forest, this epic winter calamity being fought in the last throes 1944. And should we just quickly see where we got to in the last episode?
Yes, we got up to the end of October 1944. So we started off with the assault on Aachen in September, which then sort of progressed into October, the early stages of the Hürtgen pushing in. And I think we all concluded in the first episode that while kind of probing into the Hürtgen was one thing, continuing to beat your head against a brick wall probably not so smart. And unfortunately, it continues into November, doesn't it, John?
Absolutely. And really, it's the 28th Infantry Division that really starts to take the brunt of this. Interestingly, of course, we've all heard of the exploits of Norman Dutch Coda, at Omaha Beach.
Of
when
course.
He was Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Division. He might get the Medal of Honor for it. It's still pending. He had gotten a division command, and so he's the 28th commander now. So imagine that. He gets this order to plunge into the Hurtgen Forest, and especially for his unit around the Call Trail, which that quote I read from Ed Laughlin is that part of the Hurtgen. And so
where's that geographically, John?
So that's on the way to I think it's between the towns of Kammerscheit and Schmidt.
Yes,
it's
and Schmidt's sort of towards the northern bit of the Hürtgen Forest, isn't it?
The trail is really just that. It's not a paved road, nothing along those lines. It's basically a forest trail in which you're trying to make pretty significant movement of vehicles and stuff. In terms of where it's located on the overall front, of course, you're talking about beyond Aachen. And you're talking about the heart of the 1st Army sector. So this would be, of course, north of the Ardennes, south of where 21st Army Group is, part of Germany, approaching the Ruhr River, that's what we're worried about, is the dams there. And if the Germans could open them up, what that would mean for operating on the plains around Aachen and so on and so forth. So for whatever reason, and it's not good, the Hurtgen Forest becomes the locus of 1st Army operations, and the 28th Division, Pennsylvania National Guard Bloody Bucket, really kind of gets the brunt of this because they're fighting around some of the best defended areas near Schmidt, Kammerscheid, the Call Trail. They're really these horrible places that just the very mention of it would bring a shudder to most veterans. It's I knew a number of guys too, and it was just Hürtgen was harder to talk about really than Normandy or even the Bulge. It was just something like Hemingway said, something World War I-ish about it.
Yeah. And I said it was in the northern part. It's not. It's bang in the middle towards the lakes. It's south of Düren. It's kind of the northern edge of the national park Eifel.
Yeah, it's one of many woodlands forest areas around that part of Germany, in the western part of Germany, the Black Forest being the most famous, of course. But it's sort of right there in the middle of the First Army sector. And the idea is that you can really kind of just plunge through it and get to the Ruhr River and prevent the possibility of the dams being opened up and all this. But the thing I've never quite understood is why not envelop it somehow in the more friendly terrain.
Well, a lot of that terrain around there is pretty unfriendly. So you absolutely want to go for every kind of easy option you possibly can, because there are very few. And why wouldn't you take them when they are there? Because it's not all forested. Why don't you go around the top of Aachen? Why don't you go around southern part of the Hürtgen? I don't know. You're right. It's absolutely mad. Anyway, Hodges is determined to push on into November, visits the headquarters of the 28th Division on the 1st of November, which is based at Rott, and he turns up with General Giraud and says, right, Dutch, you got to go. Coda says, when, boss? And they go tomorrow morning. So it's literally 2nd of November. Off they go.
Yeah. So you get the 112th Infantry.
Yeah, and this is seen as the preliminary assault before 7th Corps attacks on the left.
Which is also horrible.
And Hodges also says, Dutch, I want you to attack on several different thrusts. And Coda goes, well, what about concentration of force and division? Do we really want to be out on these single thrusts? But Hodges is having none of it, is he? He says, no, get on with it.
Get on with it. And the 112th Infantry takes the lead at this point.
So off they go. 9 o'clock in the morning, 2nd of November. The 28th Infantry advances from its small salient into the mist-covered forest. And, you've got the 110th Infantry on the right, immediately hammered by machine guns in pillboxes, because these are pillboxes that haven't been dealt with earlier. So they're just straight into the kind of small arms fire, and presumably a fairly robust amount of mortaring as well.
And this is the Siegfried line. You're kind of plunging straight into part of the Siegfried line here, too. Yep. So, it becomes all three regiments, the 109th, 110th, and 112th, are pretty quickly thrown into this maw. The same kind of terrain. And what's always struck me is that we are willfully negating most all of our advantages that we have. Maneuver, air power, firepower on some levels. I've never figured out how this makes any sense to anybody at the time.
So you've got the 3 infantry regiments, which we in the UK would call a brigade. Americans have regiments of 3 battalions each. So you've got 110th on the left. They're going straight into the on the right. Sorry, they're going straight into the machine guns. Then you've got the 109th on the left. They're also struggling. As they go straight into a dense minefield, but they do make some kind of progress. A German infantryman has taken POW, tells them of executions for deserters and mines behind them prevent desertions. And it's clear that these guys who are from the German 275th Infantry, they're pretty sort of ragtag. And then in the center, you've got the 3rd Infantry Regiment of the 28th Infantry Division, the 112th, and they're attacking towards the village of Vossenack, which runs along the end of a saddleback ridge about above a 200-meter deep ravine of the Corps River. And as you say, what are they doing?
It's awful.
You don't go up from ravines. That's just insane.
Makes no sense. And it's like Ed's quote, whatever that was, it's lost to history. Whatever that attack was, it was, why are you doing this? You're going straight up at these guys. They don't really even have to be that well armed or that good. They can just fire down at you like fish in a barrel.
As you say, you're putting aside your advantages or not making the most of your advantages and handing them to the enemy, because we made this point in the last episode that they don't need to be the best soldiers if they're in pillboxes and machine guns and you're serving yourself up. for dinner. I mean, basically, isn't it? It's what's happening. This goes on though, doesn't it? So the first day doesn't go brilliantly. Then the 3rd of November, the next day of this, the 112th push on again, back down the ravine, and then up another steep side and take Kommerscheid. Then a battalion leapfrogs ahead towards Schmidt.
Yeah, and this Kommerscheid's a village on the top of the ridge above the ravine. Yeah.
But are we talking? When you say village, Jim? Do you mean a dozen houses or more? Is it one of the? Is it? Because after all, village can mean anything in Second World War accounts. Sometimes it's a couple of houses.
No, I think it's a proper. It is a proper village. I mean, right. I'm looking at kind of Vostenac now. I mean, it's sort of strung out along a road.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's a single road village with bits.
Yeah,
which is why it attracts us. I mean,
of course.
Yeah.
All this springs from thinking this can be done quickly and easily, doesn't it?
This won't be too bad. They have to be diminished, and there's probably hollow defenses there. But we should have known better by November because we probed it. The 9th Division, as we talked about in the first episode, it hit pretty hard there. When you're talking about a dense forest, any opening like that and any kind of transit point becomes, of course, solid gold real estate. And the Germans know that too. And so obviously you can imagine the mining is just, one point at this stage, even the early point of the attack, Coda throws in his engineers as infantry. Anytime you see that, you got a bad situation on your hands.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening. And really the engineers, they're overstretched with this thing because, I mean, on some level, some of the most potent German defenses are just the mines. It's hard to find mines wherever they could be, but an open landscape, you have some level of chance to operate and to see them and to work with detectors or whatever. When you're talking about a constricted woodlands forest area that restricts visibility, and all the leaves and the bramble and the branches and all that, I mean, that only adds, I think, to the concealment effect. And and that's I think I mentioned that in episode 1 too, just the nature of this place, how when you're in those woods, it's as if the rest of the world doesn't exist. It's just a dark kind of place. That's even if it were a normal, say it's a nice sunny summer day, 75 degrees Fahrenheit outside. When you're in the Hurtgen Forest, it appears so much different.
It's a deep, dark place.
It's menacing. It really is. And that's without anything related to war. Imagine the fall of 1944 where the weather is starting to turn bad, especially like a lot of rain, very moist. And these kind of defenses and having to operate there and all the different ways you could get killed or maimed. I mean, it's just, I think the 28th Division is the centerpiece of this whole thing. I've always thought that they get it the worst. They suffer the most casualties. They have the least results for that. They're kind of the microcosm.
Let's go through what happens to them, because they do take Kommerscheid on the 3rd of November, and then another battalion leapfrogs through the lead battalion and actually does manage to surprise the Germans in Schmidt. They take the little town there. There's a nice little incident where Sergeant John M. Kozlowski, he stops a horse-drawn wagon with some German troops on it, or rather troops in German uniforms. And when the driver discovers that Kozlowski could speak Polish, he jumps down and kisses him on both cheeks. And these are kind of these are Ost battalions, aren't they? The 275th for the most part. Below Schmidt is, this is the big reservoir, the Schwammenau reservoir, which is only kind of a mile and a half away. This is the point where Hodges suddenly realizes that if the Germans open the dams, then the Ruhr River is going to be deluged, and his men would have no way of crossing whatsoever. And this has been kind of flagged up 6 weeks earlier and just completely ignored.
Right, we're finding this out the hard way again. It's so odd. Yeah, they take Schmidt, but they can't hold it, and that's
and also Hodges tells Lawton Collins, who's the 7th Corps commander, to wait on launching his assault until a further division has arrived, because he's worried about this flooding. And so he thinks, actually, we need to reinforce this situation. The net result of that is that Coda's 28th is left totally exposed at exactly the moment where this is the moment to exploit and reinforce, isn't it? You absolutely want to be, having got to Schmidt and within a kind of an inch of the reservoir, this is the point to absolutely go for it, isn't it? Having gone for all this effort. I think that is the worst decision of all.
It is
having made the bonkers decision to go in the first place. They've actually managed to push through. They've got their objectives. So you reinforce at that point, don't you? I mean, this is sort of classic failure of any, of offensives on the First World War, where people aren't able to exploit because you can't, the comms aren't good enough. But that's not the issue here. Hodges having a moment.
It's a great point, Jim. I mean, this is the time, and yet they don't, and yet the 28th is left on its own, which then attracts counterattacks. They're not able to hold Schmidt. I mean, so this place that becomes a seesaw throughout a lot of this. It's so demoralizing when you think about it, because it's like, okay, if we're worried about, this is the thing that's always occurred, if we're worried about flooding when we're in the forest, we were worried about that on the plains, the better ground. So why not just go that way and envelop it somehow?
Yes, it's also you're sort of worrying about something after you've left a stable door open and the horse has already bolted. You've got yourself a decision. You've got to make the best of it. And the bottom line is they haven't flooded it yet. So let's go for it before they do. Mm-hmm. But there's a sort of a terrible kind of dip in morale of the 28th Division, who are new and feeling, this is not what they signed up for. And one of the guys who deserts is Private Eddie Slovik, of course, who is the only person to be executed for desertion in the US Army in the entire Second World War.
Yeah.
They decide they need to make an example of him. And
so meaningful here.
Yeah. And he's executed for this. I mean, I'd have thought of all the times not to kind of execute someone, it's probably now. But...
And it goes all the way up to Eisenhower. And Eisenhower makes that difficult decision that he thought, you know what, I have to at least make an example of this guy, not just for the Hurtgen Forest, but for all of the whole front. And whether that's the right decision or not, I'll leave it to someone else, I guess. But it's all happening in this context.
Yes.
Eddie Slovik, look, to be fair, was not going to be a willing soldier no matter where we're operating. He just isn't wired that way. He can't operate at the front. That's the way it is with some people. But Hurtgen Forest, I think, magnifies that much more, that it's this kind of battle going on, and he just won't be part of it. Yeah. And there are, of course, many, many hundreds of others who are thinking along the same lines and kind of doing some of the same stuff as Slovik, drifting back, kind of refusing to go back. All of this is starting to happen. And I want to point out, too, the 28th Division has been through quite an odyssey. It's a really interesting unit, and it's a good unit, actually. It's a very good unit. And so they had fought in Normandy, some pretty hard fighting around Hill 112.
Mm-hmm. That's the American Hill 112 rather than the British Hill 112.
Yeah. Right. We even divide our hills, right? Exactly. Yeah. So, I guess one drives on the left side, one on the right side. I don't know. But so they've been through that. And then they have this wonderful moment. If you've ever seen the images of the American troops in Paris marching in the parade, that's the 28th Division, most of them.
Yeah.
And then they move on, and they had been dealing with the Siegfried Line and some pretty hard fighting before Hurtgen Forest, and they were doing very well. So you've taken this fine unit and just thrown it into this maw.
Yeah.
And now we have some morale problems because the toll on leaders is immense.
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it?
It is. I mean, if you're a company commander and you last...
It's all your company commanders, platoon commanders.
They're just done. I mean, if you last a couple of 3 days, you're doing very well. And so it's a classic situation where you've got sergeants commanding companies or even corporals and privates, and it's a meat grinder. And when that happens, you start to lose cohesion.
But you've also got another problem, a really bad bit of misfortune for the 28th, because they've got Schmidt. They've actually done pretty well. Now they're out on a limb because Hodges is waiting for reinforcements to arrive. On the very same day, General Feldmarschall Model is holding a MAC conference the very same moment that the news of the capture of Schmidt reaches him. But at that MAP conference is General Erich Vandenbrugger of the 7th Army and General Hasso von Manteuffel of the 5th Panzer Army. And so they're there, which means that they can organize a counter-thrust much more quickly than if they weren't. And the 116th Panzer Division, which was the last Panzer Division to reach Normandy back in the summer, is now in the area and is ordered to attack with all speed on the northern flank. And, that's a problem because suddenly you've got some half-decent German reinforcements coming into the situation exactly at the point that the 28th is on the cusp of being overreached, but also at the point where they've actually got a little victory on their hands and it's ripe for exploitation. That mistake by Hodges not reinforcing that success, that breakthrough, that's terrible.
It is.
That's a really, really bad command decision.
They're sleeping in the houses in Schmidt, aren't they, rather than defending themselves properly and digging in foxholes. And that speaks to the drain on leadership, doesn't it? Because if you've got people who know what they're doing in charge, they'll make sure that doesn't happen. All these problems create further problems, don't they, in essence? Yep. You've errors compounding further errors. When they do attack, you've got a panic, men running straight into Germans coming from the southeast, and 200 of them flee and 67 are left alive. The officers lose control of the men, such as they had control of them, and everyone hightails it back to Kommerscheid.
And then Schmidt is lost.
Yeah.
It's won and lost. This late stage in the war, you do not want to be losing blood over the same place twice. You really, really, you don't ever, but you particularly don't at this late stage of the war. And Hodges turns up at Cota's HQ to find Eisenhower, Bradley, and Giroux already there. Yeah. Feverish discussions about how to rectify the situation. But again, it's kind of...
I mean, that must be something you come back to your headquarters and there's Ike. Think, oh no, I'm in trouble now. Oh, God.
Yeah. Trouble.
Exactly.
Yeah. But Hodges takes Cota aside and says, you got to send your 112th Infantry in again to retake Schmidt. Get on with it.
Yeah.
Gives them some Shermans and a bit of air support. But of course, the Shermans couldn't make much progress on the steep tracks and mud and all the rest of it. And the fighter bombers couldn't even get airborne. So that didn't work. I mean, that's another terrible idea. And on the 7th, the 2nd Battalion, the 112th at Vossenack, which is further back from Kommerscheid, they cut and run, while the remains of the 3rd Battalion and the 1st Battalion were trapped at Kommerscheid. So Cota then sends in 146 engineers as infantry. Yeah. And they managed to hold the western part of Vossenack. But the situation is so bad that suddenly, Hodges has no choice but to hurry in the 4th Infantry Division to reinforce the 28th. And, again, it's a really bad night. Night of the 8th of November, US artillery, lays down a massive bombardment around Kommerscheid to allow survivors of the 3rd and 1st of the battalions of the 112th to pull back across the Karl Ravine. I mean, can you imagine it? You think what you've done to get down that ravine and up the other side again and take those 3 key villages of Kommerscheid, Vossenack and Schmidt and to lose all of it. By morning on the 9th of November, they're basically back where they started, and they've got 5,684 battle and non-battle casualties. And the 112th has lost 2,000 men.
Yeah. That's 2/3 of its strength.
Yeah.
At best. It's probably even more.
Yeah.
And now for nothing, because you've been pushed right back there. Just think about the morale issues of all this operating in this place.
It's clear that kind of sort of Bradley's understood this because Chet Hansen, his aide, writes this in his diary. Says when the strength of an outfit in the line drops below a certain point, something very bad happens to it and its effectiveness falls away sharply. What happens to it is that there are not enough experienced men left in to make the replacements, the reinforcements, savvy. And, you're absolutely spot on. If you haven't got those people who've got that sixth sense who understand how these things work, you're just stuffed because, new people coming into a situation like this, I mean, no training is going to prepare you for it.
And that's why Slovik is a really interesting microcosm, because that's what's happening. That there's, I mean, he's the best example and the most notorious, but there's many others who are just like, I'm done with this, or I don't know what to do, or I'm just getting out of here. I mean, who could blame him?
But Hodges is still not saying, okay, we need to cut our losses and think of plan B. He goes, right, let's send more people in. And still no plan to swing to the south of the reservoir where, I can see this. I'm looking at the map now. I mean, you've got a much clearer path through the forest to the south of it than you have through the centre.
You do.
So suddenly you've got the 1st Division, the 8th Division, the 104th Division, the 5th Armoured Division, the rest of the 4th Division, all flung into the Hürtgen.
Oh, goodness me.
Yeah, exactly. This is pretty far forward for Hodges to visit the 28th Division command post because, we talk about the Army commanders like Patton or Eichelberg or whatever, they tend to be forward a lot. Hodges was kind of the opposite. So he was far enough forward that I think he should have been expected to glean the situation better than what he did. And I think Bradley, too. I've always sort of laid it to some extent at his feet, too, that he was in a position where he could have put his figurative foot down and said, well, wait now, this isn't working. This isn't the right deal. Why don't we come up with something else? Collins, as 7th Corps commander, this isn't his finest hour, but to some extent, he's beholden to 1st Army on this concept. Right. And same with Giroux at 5th Corps. So it's an Army level concept, maybe is the way to think of it. And it's the 28th that gets the worst of it, in addition to these other divisions that you mentioned. But the 28th, I think more so than others, I think they suffer over 6,000 casualties by the time this is done. They gain like nothing. It's kind of just staggering to think of. And they really did the Brother Brunt, the Call Trail. where the vehicles bogged down and very much immobilized and destroyed, and this becomes really the graveyard of this part of the front. In terms of the offenses, I mentioned the mines, but by now, of course, the famous tree bursts have come into effect. So Hemingway's quote, "This is another force multiplier for the Germans because they have pretty good artillery. They always did. And they can just send those shells out there into this woodlands, and the trees multiply the fragmentation effect of the explosion of those shells, which only makes this more horrifying and terrifying for the American soldiers who are down there. So how do you shield yourself from that? You almost can't. You got to hug the trees.
Yeah,
literally. Very different connotation than now being a tree hugger, but that's how you would survive. Weirdly.
Well, should we take a break and then come back with a third offensive in the Hürtgen?
In the meantime, British Second Army, they're clearing the Nijmegen salient and have managed to make progress. But, I mean, it's this conundrum that Hodges has made for himself. How do you solve it? Let's find out after the break. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, USA, with me, Al Murray, John McManus, and James Holland. And I'm going to say this, we're normally pretty jolly chatting to one another about this, but a mood of gloom has descended upon this podcast.
Upon Team We Have Ways, yeah.
I mean, it feels like, this is an Escher engraving. There's no way out of this.
Well, also, it feels like you shouldn't be getting yourself in this pickle at this late stage of the war. Okay, it's winter. Okay, it's Europe. Okay, the conditions are difficult and the topography is difficult, but the Americans by this point should have enough in the bank to be able to make better decisions.
Especially as one of the things we've always talked about on the podcast since right from the start is how quick the Americans are at learning, how adaptable they are, how they digest lessons so quickly. So it's interesting that they're foxed by this. So the third offensive is launched on the 16th of November. Great news, everyone. The rain is turning to sleet and snow now on the higher ground. Heavies are brought in to flatten the towns of Eschweiler and Jülich.
You said that beautifully. You said Jülich.
I wanted to make sure that one of us got these right.
And it was only one of us.
The big red one advance in the north towards Düren. And as they enter the forest, and they've got armour with them this time, they come under heavy artillery and small arms fire from 12th Volksgrenadier Division, which is interesting, isn't it?
Yep.
It doesn't matter who you run up against if they're properly in place. This is why you want to go round the Siegfried line and not get stuck in it, after all. They get held up. The Americans respond with their 4.2-inch mortars, but it's wet, it's cold, propellant isn't working as well as it could, the blast plates are getting stuck in the mud, and the Germans know the terrain and are ready for this. So what are you going to do?
Yeah, what are you going to do?
And this goes on, the 17th, they're still going forward, and you've got this great quote here, Jim, go on. Let's dazzle John with more American accents.
Just before dawn, a large bombardment began mainly hitting the trees above us. Being night and really dangerous, the new troops became very anxious and started moving around in panic. I tried to hold on to one or two of them, just saying, "Stay in your foxholes or you may get killed." This was the first time I'd seen battlefield panic and could understand how some men got very traumatized and shell-shocked. Other later cases were sent to the rear for treatment. It is too dangerous for the rest of us to have such disturbances in our midst while we need to move forwards.
Pretty good.
Yeah, not bad, Jim.
Oh, cheers, John. Yeah.
Masquerade for me. I mean,
yeah. Yeah, there you go.
It just all sounds absolutely horrendous.
Horrendous, doesn't it? But meanwhile, 4th Infantry Division, led by Colonel Buck Lanham's 22nd Infantry Regiment in the centre, is set out up on the ridge that runs down to Schmidt. They plan to hit Grosshau, while the 8th Division on the right attacks the village of Hürtgen and then Kleinhau. But the casualties, once again, are absolutely horrendous, and they have no idea that the reason why they're defending so heavily really is also partly because the start line just to the south is for the launch of Wacht am Rhein, which of course is going to be the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans are nervous about those plans getting disturbed and disrupted. So they're hitting it very, very hard to protect the battle plans they're getting ready for Wacht am Rhein.
Yeah, and Buck Lanham was a remarkable guy. Really dynamic and colorful commander. He's close with Ernest Hemingway, of course. That's how Hemingway really gets a lot of the color he does in terms of writing about this.
Right.
And, Robert Sterling Rush has written a fascinating book about the 22nd Infantry Lanham's unit, fighting in Hürtgen. And you really do see what happens to the combat effectiveness just eroding so quickly in this particular attack, especially. You just can't get that back.
Yeah.
These guys are gone. You can't get it back in any amount of time. And so once again, you've got another failed initiative here.
You've got too many new junior officers coming in, haven't you?
Yeah.
They're making mistakes, and the Germans are really, really good at exploiting those mistakes. So if the Germans fall back at night, for example, the ground is immediately taken. And the Germans also twig that the Americans are tending to only do recce patrols if an attack is coming. So they're kind of warned and prepared accordingly. And what the Germans are trying to do is obviously absolutely safeguard their panzers as much as they possibly can, so to keep them hidden, hull down by day, and then move them out on jitter operations at night, which is very unusual because the Germans traditionally don't like night operations and tend not to do many night operations. But here, suddenly, getting towards the end of the war, it's dark, they're in the forest where they have all the advantages, and so they're going for it. So when that happens, American infantry tend to kind of panic. I mean, as you would, it's dark, it's pitch night, and you hear the sort of clank and squeak of Tiger tanks and Panthers. I mean, flipping out, who can blame them?
What are you going to do?
What are you going to do? So, and they tend to kind of panic when their own tanks pull back at night to refill and arm, which they're always going to do.
So how do Lanham's 22nd Infantry do, Jim?
Yeah, well, they do finally manage to reach the top of the hill near the hamlet of Kleinhau. They overrun outposts, but then they're stopped by booby traps and barbed wire, which is 25 yards deep. And as they're surveying this, a salvo of mortars comes down and all 3 battalion commanders are killed in one go. I mean, can you imagine?
Just like that. They're gone.
And then the Germans strip a badly wounded American of all his possessions and place an explosive charge under him. He's not found for 70 hours, but he's still alive enough to warn his rescuers. I mean, just, so there's also, not only are you in the deep dark wood, not only are you inexperienced, the Germans are fighting with a kind of, forget the Geneva Convention, this is close quarter, no holds barred, brutal kind of Eastern Front style stuff.
This is savage.
But we talked earlier about the Americans learning. This is when it starts to happen, doesn't it, Jim?
Yeah. Let's not forget, who've landed at Utah Beach, battled their way through, got off quite lightly then, but then suffer horrifically in the Cotentin Peninsula. So literally every soldier in the 4th Infantry Division now will be completely different to the ones that landed on the 6th of June. I mean, there'll be some wounded guys who've come back and whatever, but I mean, it's got to be a kind of 80% turnaround.
But they start modifying their method to deal with the situation. So they split companies into assault groups. The assault groups have only got personal weapons and grenades. Support groups are behind and they have mortars and machine guns. They're starting to try and adapt to the circumstances. The scouts and assault groups in front, they have to use compasses to keep on track. As they advance, the support groups are wheeling out signal wire for comms, but also to guide runners. So there's adaptation happening. But I mean, if you're losing battalion commanders just like that, you can adapt all you like, but if they go, you've got to start again, haven't you? This is extremely difficult. And they're using tracks and fire breaks as center lines, not as boundaries. So they're advancing up things rather than over them, which is an interesting adaptation. And they do actually start making progress, don't they?
Yeah.
Even though it's getting colder and colder. And, you've got these things where they've thrown their heavy coats away because they're heavy and wet, but now they need their heavy coats.
Oh, they hated those overcoats.
We got another quote from Arthur Couch. He says, "A heavy snow 2 feet or more fell on the whole forest. One day we were walking through a forward area where another company had made an earlier attack. I saw a line of about 6 soldiers standing, leaning forward and pointed rifles in deep snow, seemingly in an attack. But then I noticed they didn't move at all. I said to a comrade, 'They must be dead and have frozen stiff as they were hit.' I had taken the precaution of stuffing my left breast pocket with German coins to block a bullet or shrapnel to my heart. But I knew it was silly. But it might have saved him because, he was there to write that memoir post-war. So,
yeah. It strikes me how they are innovating a little bit at this small unit level. And it's kind of similar to the German storm companies in World War I.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly what it is, isn't it?
You know what I mean? But obviously that was on a much larger level. But this is a micro level of just this one unit trying to adapt somehow. And it's remarkably similar, actually, to that it's set up that the Germans had with the weapons they had at that time. But, the progress we have with the 22nd Infantry is really just local progress. It doesn't quite impact the larger effort we have in the Hurtgen Forest, unfortunately. Right. And then, like you said, the weather goes sideways. And it becomes this sort of project that we've started and that we just kind of leave there.
Well, yeah, but it's also, you find with the Hürtgen every single time, you're up against the odds anyway. You've been given a really, really bad hand. But the moment you do make some progress, something comes in to kind of spoil it. Either Hodges holding back reserves or then deciding that actually he's going to throw the kitchen sink at it, but too late, or then it suddenly starts to kind of freeze. I mean, every time there's something that is just mitigating against your kind of fast progress.
Or the fact it turns out this is the start line the Germans need to defend that you don't even know about.
Yeah.
It's not just the rest of the broad front. This is an important place as far as the Germans are concerned.
Yeah.
Well, meanwhile, I mean, you've got Third Army. Patton has encircled Metz on the 18th of November, and on the 22nd, the city's been taken. But that in itself has been a bloodbath. So, I mean...
Yeah, and then he can't make the most of it because he can't get across the Moselle because of the flooding, because of the rain.
Yeah, it's all slow going. This is what happens when you fight outside the campaigning season. They should have stopped mid-September, said, everyone's going home now.
Next spring.
We're resuming the spring. See you in March, everybody.
Yeah.
Would have been much more civilized. Absolutely.
Much more civilized way of going about things.
Yes.
And in the Hürtgen, you end up with the firepower starting to take more of the strain. So Schmidt's 275th Infantry are using 131 guns.
Yeah, General Schmidt, not to be confused with the village of Schmidt.
Yes, the place of Schmidt. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
They're using whatever they can get their hands on, so French, Russian, Italian guns. It's interesting, isn't it? Those things would have all solved the problem much earlier, but now you're bogged down. It just creates an ever more difficult terrain to fight through and to manage. So you've got the dead everywhere. You've got the forest reduced to stumps and filth, haven't you? And
it's a charnel house, isn't it? It's just absolutely horrendous. And, and everyone's suffering from disease and hypothermia and trench foot and, illness and all that. But the Germans particularly, it has to be said. But once again, biggest killer?
Mortars.
Yep.
The mortar that creates tree bursts on a very accurate local level. Yeah.
And it's easy to bring up all those incredible advantages that mortar fire has, and localized. You're not radioing back to anywhere for it, are you necessarily? Especially if you're fighting the support groups and all that. It's mortar's doing the trick, isn't it?
And I'll tell you who's there. It's J.D. Salinger.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's interesting because if you want to know why he was so sardonic and so, dark on many levels, this is one of the major reasons. And of course, he'd been badly scarred at Normandy. I'm talking about emotionally. Because he's part of the 4th Infantry Division. Yeah. And he's actually a lot of times operating with the counterintelligence corps, from that point forward, like interrogating civilians, that kind of thing. But he's really experiencing quite a bit of frontline combat. But it's especially here in the Hurtgen Forest that he really, is just devastated on many levels. And he's had discourse with Ernest Hemingway, who he's asked to read his novel and all this kind of thing.
Right.
Hemingway's not the best mentor, as you might imagine, but there is at least a link there. Yeah. It's really interesting that Salinger, his literature kind of comes out of this experience on some levels.
How amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually the advisor for a book about him. His larger life, but I was the historical advisor in a film, really interesting film that came out on Salinger several years ago, just called that, it's Salinger. So it was kind of interesting to delve into his world.
I bet. Yeah.
The 4th Division. You don't think of that, you think of him as the literary figure, but it was, World War II was a seminal experience for him. And I just think you can't quite understand his writings without understanding something about this.
If you don't know about this,
isn't that interesting?
Incredible.
Some black humor starting to creep in as well.
Oh yeah, I love this sardonic joke here.
After 5 days up there, you talk to the trees. On the 6th, you start getting answers back.
And then Captain Ingersoll, I think this will be Ralph Ingersoll, who's one of Bradley's aides. The young battalion commanders who came out of the Hurtgen Forest were as near gibbering idiots as men could get without being locked up for it.
Isn't that amazing?
Jeez. Yep. And that's battalion commanders. Imagine privates.
And it's chewing through people. So in the first 3 days of the offensive, 22nd Infantry Regiment in the 4th Division suffered 391 battle casualties, including 28 officers and 110 NCO. So that tells you something as well, that leadership is getting chewed through because you need leadership. So leaders go forward because they know they need to lead, and they're getting killed, and they're getting killed and injured. The quote right at the start about the major dead at the front of a charge, this is the point, isn't it? It's that these situations require leadership, and unfortunately for the people who've graduated as officers, they're going to cop it. And then, of course, you get the problem that as they're being attrited, you've got inexperienced filling the gap, so you're making mistakes.
Yeah. I mean, you always kind of think, well, we've got this huge advantage in air power. It's not like the Arbos aren't coming over, the fighter bombers. They are coming over, but they're only coming over when the sky's clear, which is all too rare.
Yeah.
They're now using kind of white phosphorus bombs, which are pretty horrendous. But the Germans just keep fighting. I mean, there's a great line from Eisenhower where he says, the Germans have long gone past the point where any normal people would have surrendered, but they're not normal, and so they just keep fighting because they're facing Armageddon. So you might as well just keep going. And so they do. And they're constantly counterattacking, which is what Germans also want to do. And obviously this holds up the US advance, but also, they're getting treated like crazy at the same time.
Yeah. And of course, the air power, its effectiveness is diminished. And we'd seen this in Normandy, actually, in the hedgerow country, that there was only so much a fighter bomber could do for you when you're operating in the hedgerows and the Germans are dug in there or whatever. It's kind of similar here. I mean, there's not that much they can do for us beyond just the weather, even if it's good weather. You're talking about thick woodlands, and the technology of the time, So to me, those guys might as well be operating on the moon on some levels. It's there's nothing much they can do for you. There's not that much that your armor can do for you, So this becomes an infantry engineer kind of fight without all the support. Hence, our earlier point about how we're negating our advantages here of maneuver. And in terms of the leadership, Hurtgen Forest as a whole, but especially at this late stage, is just a leadership wood chipper. I mean, that's what it is. You're just smashing through, grinding through platoon leader, company commander after another. And battalion commanders, too. It affects them more so than you might otherwise see in a lot of other battles. And in a way, it's a tribute to them that the casualty rates are so high. It shows that they were trying to lead.
They are doing their job, yeah.
But it's so deadly. I don't care how good you are. And so, again, that's another reason why this is kind of lunacy to be sacrificing our leaders and our combat troops in this kind of unwieldy environment. And it's one of the reasons why it's depressing, I think. it's very World War One-ish.
On Thanksgiving Day, the 23rd of November, you have this extraordinary thing, Ike ordering that every soldier under his command should have a turkey dinner. I think obviously that probably seems like a great idea back in Versailles. In Hürtgen, the battalion cooks do this in Hürtgen with turkey sandwiches.
But to go and get your turkey sandwiches, you've got to get out of your foxhole.
You've got to leave your foxhole.
That's dangerous.
and they're getting hit by German artillery fire as they do.
Yeah. But that had become really a tradition in the American Armed Forces to make sure to get Thanksgiving dinner to everybody. So this was happening all over the globe, no matter where we were fighting. So you could be in Leyte. It's just really a very similar fight going on there on some levels.
Yeah. Well, there is this one tragic story of an officer who witnesses his men getting up and getting killed as they're going for their turkey dinner. He survives the war and reckons he can never eat turkey again. And every Thanksgiving Day, he'd get up, head to the backyard and just sit and weep.
Hard to blame him.
I imagine he wasn't the only one. That there
exactly.
Same kind of thing.
Yeah.
So 29th of November, so 6 days after Thanksgiving, Kleinhau and Grosshau finally cleared. Taken 2 weeks. The 8th Division finally captures Hürtgen after a mad charge, followed by close quarter fighting through the village. And the 83rd Division, at long last begins to replace the battered and beleaguered 4th Infantry Division. Artillery pours onto the village of Gay ahead of an attack, but even there it still involves house-to-house fighting. And it's not until the end of the first week of December the Americans are at long last out of the forest and looking down on the Ruhr Valley. But even then, Schmidt is still in German hands, having had it at the beginning, on the 3rd of November. There we are, 5 to 6 weeks later, it's still in German hands.
Unbelievable.
Incredible. And the casualties, of course.
Well, and it's not until February 1945 that the dams are finally secured.
And that's the quote that I read from Ed Laughlin. That's the context of his quote, because the 82nd Airborne was operating in that area. This is post-Bulge, and they'd had quite a hell of a fight in the Bulge.
Yeah.
Now they come to this battlefield. In the case of that quote, the person who, the paratrooper, Ed Laughlin, was a very good friend of mine. And he told me that was seeing the aftermath of this fight. He said that might have been one of the roughest things he'd seen in the war or experienced. Just
wow.
And he didn't know the context or anything at the time as a 20-year-old kid. He'd read about it some later in life, but even then it was hard for him to process. And I really do think that's emblematic of the larger fight for Hürtgen, that it was just a waste. That's what occurred to him. It's like, what a waste this is. What were we doing? And I think that this sort of stands as the theme overall.
So you think Hodges deserves the kind of bad shtick he gets for it?
I do think he does, yeah. And I'm inclined to, be lenient to Hodges on a lot of levels earlier in the war. But
we're all pretty lenient to generals, I think, for the most part.
I think we are. I think we're very, pretty fair, and I think Hodges does an okay job in Normandy and whatever. But this is really kind of uncalled for, and it's just such a lack of flexibility. And I've always wondered whether it comes from his penchant for not being at the front much. That to me, any general who's right there where the combat is going on is going to see that this isn't working and have to adjust accordingly. He gets as far forward as the 28th Division CP, but that's before the worst of this really happens on some levels. And I just think Hodges, and I would play some of it for Bradley. I think they deserve the lion's share of the blame, in my opinion. Of course, debatable. But I think that they weren't very flexible. They didn't adjust particularly well.
What's the alternative course of action? Because after all, it's not an Allied defeat, but it's a Pyrrhic victory, right? So what's the what if? What's the alternate option, do you think?
I think to envelop it on either side in the more transit-friendly terrain. I don't think I would have no illusions that that'd be easy. And we're always worried about them flooding. And there is some flooding that happens and all that. In retrospect, I'd rather bite that bullet than deal with the Hürtgen mess. I mean, we all saw that. I mean, we know how it turns out as historians, of course, obviously. Yeah. But I think a highly trained general should be able to glean that and realize it's not a good idea to be operating in these thick woodlands. You've got the better part of First Army thrown into this. I mean, how does that make any sense? So I think you're better off taking your chances elsewhere.
And the casualties are horrendous.
33,000 out of 120, and I think that's kind of an underestimate, but that's the official casualties, that we have. And a lot of them are, of course, non-battle casualties, which aren't. Trench foot, disease, like pneumonia, and of course, combat fatigue, all related to combat.
Well, there's 37% of troops in the Hurtgen Forest have to be treated for respiratory diseases. So this is the highest of the whole war. 8,000 cases of psychological collapse.
Yeah, with combat fatigue. Yeah. And that's probably an underestimate because for every documented case, there's probably others who are in a similar boat.
Yeah.
And 4th Infantry Division alone loses 5,000 casualties and 2,500 non-battle casualties. That's 7,500 out of a fighting force of, say, 9,500.
It's the division being about 16, but a lot of that isn't the fighting force.
Yeah, but infantry.
Exactly. And right. So it's pretty much everybody. And at least 4th Division had something to show for it in terms of ground gain. 28th Division suffers over 6,000 casualties for next to nothing.
Yeah.
And then, by the way, what's the reward? Oh, we're going to station you in the Ardennes.
Yes.
In the east of Bastogne.
Where it's nice and quiet.
It's a quiet sector. And of course, we all know what happens there. And that's another example why I think it's a remarkable unit to fight so well in the Bulge after what happens to them at Hürtgen. For nothing, for no results of any kind. So this sort of goes away in our popular memory because the Bulge is about to happen. And obviously that becomes the story. After the Bulge is done, we kind of return to it in terms of, like you said, pushing to the Ruhr and grabbing those dams in February 45 and the aftermath of Call Trail. You can imagine how many MIAs there were probably in this larger battle because that with forests, that tends to happen.
People getting lost and vanishing,
It's really not until about the 1980s, I think, that Hurtgen Forest gets on the radar screen of our popular memory of World War II, I'll say. I mean, historians knew about it, of course, but the average person exploring it, it's a pretty long time until after.
Well, I don't know. Like I said at the start of this part, gloom has descended upon us with this story. The thing is you're absolutely right, Johnny. The Bulge then does come to completely overshadow this, doesn't it? It feels like much of the decisions around the Bulge are made because of, if you're fighting this battle, there aren't people to guard the Ardennes sector, as many people, because you've piled so many units into the Hürtgen.
Yeah.
Great point.
That's a really good point.
That directly then leads to the effect that the Germans have a softer area to attack, don't they? Because so much manpower has been soaked up in this. And had Hodges played this differently, the Bulge may have been stopped in its tracks sooner or not been quite the spectacular that the Germans hoped for to start with.
Yep, it's a fair point.
Very possible. Yep. All part of the tragedy of this. Yeah.
Well, I'm still really glad we've done this deep dive because it is like the Deep Dark Forest. It's a deep dark story and it's one that sort of is in the shadows a little bit and one that I think the majority of people know about but don't know about, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
They know it's awful, they know it's grim, they know it's in a forest, but that's about it. So to do a little bit of detail on it in this 80th anniversary year is a good thing to do.
Brilliant.
It's been fascinating, grimly fascinating.
Yes.
Exactly.
Thanks, gents. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We hope you enjoyed that. I mean, is enjoy the right word? I don't know. Sometimes I wonder. I found it interesting.
Absorbed by it, maybe.
That's the best we can offer.
Yeah. The American accents weren't too distracting for those of you stateside, but they came with John McManus' seal of approval. So, back off. Anyway.
So come to me if you have problems.
We'll see you all very soon. Thank you very much for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, Al Murray, James Holland, and John McManus. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.
See ya.